But is it better? Which is your session? Do you know? Ask her. Whose session? No, this is the session. No, not her. Oh. So when is your whose session is this? Yeah, what's your name? Which one is it? What's your name? How do you pronounce it? Lingzi? Ling? Lingzi. Yeah. Sorry, my name is equally bad. Veera Raghavan is going to be hard to pronounce. Are you ready? I'm ready. All right, we're going to be starting in a minute. You ready? Okay. So we're going to get started. I know lunch is hard to get out of, but the session is called Engaging Mobilities. We have Kentaro Toyama, who's going to be presenting a previously published work on IT, Information Technology for Development, titled From Needs to Aspirations in Information Technology for Development. Kentaro.
Can I use the mic? Excuse me, yeah, it's on there. It's right here. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back from lunch in a hurry. So I will be talking about what I believe is a better approach to doing the kinds of projects that many of us do. And I want to start by telling you a story. So about, I guess now it's been a dozen years ago, I was in an area near Jhansi in Madhya Pradesh, visiting a bunch of telecenters, and along the way I met this gentleman in the middle. He was a retired Air Force lieutenant by the name of AVM Sani, and in his retirement he decided he was interested in helping rural development in this particular community. And so what he did was to help these communities build what are called check dams, which basically slow the flow of water in the community. And if you build a check dam right after a village, it turns out that that entire area is suffused with water. And so you can suddenly grow things that you couldn't grow before because there wasn't enough water in the soil itself. Now, when I met him, he had just succeeded in converting this village, which only used to have 1 harvest a year, to 2 harvests a year, effectively doubling the income of every household in the village, right? And this was a very poor village, and so they're doubling the income literally meant from going from about $150 per year income to about $300 per year income. Now, when I met him, he said something really interesting to me. He said, okay, so he believed that this community was actually easily capable of getting in 3 harvests per year with these check dams. And so he was trying to encourage the farmers in the village to try to grow 3 crops. And at that point, he got pushback from the community. And one of the comments that apparently a man made was something along this line, which was, who is this old man who is coming around, pushing us to do more work than we really want to do? Now, for many of us, earning less than $1 a day over a year is unbelievable poverty, right? And so you would think that this is a need for this community to earn more money. They did not perceive it that way. They did not aspire to working all through the year just so that they could grow 3 different crops. In other contexts, sometimes we think of sanitation as a need. But there's a lot of studies that suggest that, all these programs to install toilets in rural India inevitably fail. I have certainly seen lots and lots of buildings that look exactly like this, in which the toilets are not used. They're often used for other things, if at all, and so on. So something is not connecting between the supposed need that we project onto these communities and their desire to actually use it. Here's another one. So a lot of people believe that freedom is a fundamental need, that political freedom is a need, that freedom from even slavery is a need. Kevin Bales is a man who studies different forms of modern slavery in the world, and he basically tells a story about this couple who was in basically bonded labor in India, northern India, and they, through an inheritance, were able to buy their way out of that bonded labor. Okay, they were basically slaves before, they were able to buy their way out of slavery, and then the man says this, but I was worried all the time. What if one of the children got sick? What if our crop failed? What if the government wanted some money? Since we no longer belong to the landlord, we didn't get food every day as before. Finally, I went to the landlord and asked him to take us back. Okay, to me, this is shocking, right? It is shocking that somebody would give up their freedom for these other things. And again, I think this is because our conception of what is a need is very differently felt by different people. Now, what I'm going to try to attempt to do is to suggest that needs are not the thing that we should be focusing on in ICTD projects. But we have in this community at least two historical reasons why needs are prominent and why we think about needs. One is that we have inherited from the social science and international development community this tendency to focus on needs. There's a history in social work, in international development, to do things that are called needs assessments. And that idea came out of educational technology, it turns out, but for the last several decades, how many of you have at least heard of what a needs assessment is? Quite a few, and how many of us have performed them? I certainly have, right? An attempt to understand the needs of the community. Meanwhile, in the other tradition that we inherit from in ICTD is the kind of design and engineering community. And in that community, we have very well-known figures like Don Norman. Most of you have probably, if you have any kind of human-computer interaction background or a design background, you've probably read something by him or heard about him. And this is a critical thing that he says about how designers should think, which is good design puts human needs, capabilities, and behavior first, then designs to accommodate those needs, capabilities, and ways of behaving. We have to accept human behavior the way it is, not the way we should be. Okay, so what is that basically saying? It's saying that the ethics of design is not to try to change people, but to try to work around who they are and somehow cause a positive change in the world anyway. Now, the thing about needs is that if you think about it, they're actually they have a dark side. So one of them is that any definition of needs is usually based on things like this. So this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. There's multiple definitions, of course, but the one that really strikes out to me is this one. Violence, force, constraint, or compulsion exercised upon a person. Right? We're talking about something that comes from a very dark place as a need. And in fact, I do think that needs have a range of problems that those of us in development should really think about. For example, they're motivated by negative feelings or events. They're often intense but fleeting, so they come and go. One way to see that is very difficult fact of trying to sell insurance to people who don't think they need it. They experience a challenge, they can understand intellectually why they should buy insurance, but they can't quite get themselves to do it. Their needs are often not acted upon despite what we think from the outside. They're often second guessed by subjects in our own community in ICTD. Nikki Dell and others found that people inflate their needs when they're speaking to somebody that they think might help them. They're also projected onto people by other sides. And then the other thing about needs is I think it invites charity as a solution. And I mean charity in a broad sense of fixing a problem rather than trying to see a different way to look at these challenges. So is there an alternative focus on needs? There is a phrase, needs and aspirations, that many of us use. It turns out that this phrase appears to have its origins in around sometime in the mid-1800s, and its use, as you can see, has increased. And the very idea that you need to say both needs and aspirations suggests that they're different things. Right? Otherwise, you would just use one or the other word as synonyms. And so one question is, what exactly is an aspiration? There are many academic definitions of aspirations. I will not go through all of them here, but I personally have found these definitions to be somehow anemic, often not capturing the more commonplace understanding of what an aspiration is. So instead, I'm going to go to the dictionary definitions and try to extract what dictionaries have in common about how they define aspirations. So again, taking from the Oxford English Dictionary and a couple other dictionaries, let's see what elements these definitions have in common. So the first one is that an aspiration is a type of desire, right? All three definitions have desire, longing, wish, some kind of desire. The second one is that that desire is somehow persistent or strong. Okay, so it's not the fleeting desire you have to want to go get a chai. It's not the fleeting desire you might have to want to own a particular brand of mobile phone. It's a somewhat more persistent thing. And then the third thing is that aspirations tend to aim for something higher, right? So above one, higher grade, elevated, or even spiritual. And what I'm going to suggest in the rest of the talk is that thinking of trying to find challenges where the solutions are hooked into people's aspirations is a more effective, eventually, and more meaningful way to do development projects. So the definition I'm going to go with again is that an aspiration is a type of desire that is persistent and aiming for something higher. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 conjectures. This is a very preliminary proposal. I have certainly not done a lot of research on this to really confirm all these things, so I'm just going to make 3 conjectures about this idea of needs. The first one is that aspirations are in fact very different from needs. You can tell just by the definitions, needs tend to be motivated by negative feelings like, hunger, anger, depression. Aspirations tend to be aimed at positive life changes. Needs are often fleeting, right? People don't really feel needs on an ongoing basis. If they did, arguably, they would not survive. Aspirations tend to be persistent, right? So from year to year, my aspirations, for example, for my own personal life and career tend to be relatively stable. Needs are very easy to project from the outside. When you see somebody who's earning less than $1 a day, somebody who doesn't have a clean toilet to go to, you imagine they need those things. But as the example showed earlier, that's not necessarily the way that needs are perceived by the people themselves. Whereas aspirations are often more self-determined. Okay, the second conjecture is that aspirations can be operationalized. So for some time now, I have taken various opportunities to insert one question in various surveys and so on that I have undertaken through other research projects, and that question is the following. Among those things which you have some control over, what would you most like to change about yourself or your life over the next 5 years? And it took some time to get to this wording. The word aspiration doesn't easily translate into other languages, and so you can't use that word directly. You need to ask about things that people can change in some longer-term time frame. Otherwise, they talk about how they want to buy this model of mobile phone tomorrow, or how they want to, do something for their family the next week. And you want to talk about things that people have some control over, so that it's not just blind wishes that people are conflating. And in one particular sample survey that I answered this question in Kenya, where the N was quite large, here are some of the sample responses. So people say things like, to advance my education, so I can earn a better paying job, live in a better place, to start a business, to have children, provide for them, do more community service. And if you take this list of about 2,000 responses and code them, they cluster into a relatively small number of categories. And if you look at them, they tend to be things that are reasonably positive, right? By some definition of what you think is positive. None of the people ever suggest that they want to, for example, become a successful drug lord, right? Nobody is saying that they want to become a mass murderer, and nothing along those, the chances of operationalizing this idea are good. And then the third conjecture I'm going to make is that aspirations are, in fact, a better way to think about engagement in development activity than needs. Now, that's not to say that needs shouldn't be addressed. I think they should, but aspirations, I think, are better as a primary framework. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is, again, they're focused on more optimistic emotions. The second is that they're connected to long-term desires, and all of us know how difficult it is to actually change things in any individual life or in a community. So you need a desire that is long-term in order to sustain any kind of overall change. They tend towards possible human changes, as you saw just in that preliminary survey. And then I think the nice thing about aspirations is that they elicit mentorship as a response, as opposed to charity. Right? So when somebody has an aspiration, your goal is not to provide that better education for them in and of itself and expect that that's going to be solved in a week. Your goal is to say, well, let me try to help you get that education. Or if somebody wants a better paying job, it's not that you're just going to go out and create a job for them. You're instead going to try to find ways to help them get those better jobs, ways to train them, and so on. And then finally, I think one thing that's really interesting about aspirations is that they apply to everybody. right? So, in my own life, I have aspirations, and they're the things that drive the direction in which I take my career and the way I direct my personal life. And so this is a scale which, unlike material needs, doesn't end, right? It keeps going. So just to, are you saying 0? 3 minutes, yeah. So to give you some sense for how aspirations might work. So earlier we talked about the difficulty of getting people to to actually use toilets. In Haryana as well as in Orissa, there was an interesting campaign called the No Toilet, No Bride campaign, in which they basically used various ads and social marketing to get potential grooms to think of toilets as a middle-class luxury that if they didn't have in their house, their wives would not marry them. And to the wives, they sold this as, look, you need to have a private place to go to the bathroom, and if your future husband can provide that thing, why should you marry him? And apparently this was a very successful campaign. Something like, the households with marriageable boys had an 11% increase in the number of toilets over this period. Another one more from the ICT context. So at Microsoft Research in Bangalore, when I was there, we ran a project called Kelsa Plus, in which we provided a free internet-connected PC for use by all of our cleaning staff, kind of technician staff, security guards, and we wanted to see what would happen. The project was, it didn't really have any significant positive outcomes except for this one security guard. He used this computer to practice data entry skills for which he was taking classes outside, and then he reported to us one day that he now got a computer job, which we believe was a data entry job, and he was extremely proud of this fact. He apparently was taking a small pay cut at that time, but he was very proud of the fact that he was now in a different kind of class, and I would say it's because he found a way to connect this project to his own personal aspiration that this result was achieved. And then the last example is that in around Delhi, the economist Rob Jensen did an interesting project where he worked with a recruiter of BPO companies to intentionally recruit talented women from some of these communities to work in a BPO firm in the city. Of course, the moment they were hired, they would earn much more than anybody else in their family, and so on. And what he found, this was in a randomized control experiment across villages, what he found was that in the villages in which these women were hired, there was a measurable improvement in the number of girls attending school in the ensuing years, as well as a measurable improvement in their body mass index. So parents were much more willing to invest in their girl children when they suddenly realized that they potentially could lead to better economic situations. Since I'm running out of time, I'm just going to quickly suggest that I believe an aspirational framework connects with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but slightly rethought, and that if you understand how individuals grow through aspirations, you can conceivably understand at least a significant part of how societies go from growth to flourishing. Thank you.
So actually, we're going to have questions after the next session, because next paper, because very related to this. So please hold your questions. We're running out of time. So, Neha. So Neha Kumar, she's going to be talking about aspirations-based design. So it's very carefully orchestrated to have it next to Kentaro's session. So hopefully it's be relevant. Okay.
Hi everyone. So there will be some repetition in this talk. I had asked Kentaro to give me some idea of what he would be presenting, and I have, so I should start with saying that the inspiration behind this paper was really Kentaro's work, and so it seemed like a good idea to have the papers back to back. So I'm presenting on aspirations-based design, and this is joint work with a bunch of my students and was done at Georgia Tech. Research and practice in the field of HCI, or human-computer interaction, are innately committed to building better futures. They fulfill this commitment by realizing novel, creative, and useful ways for computing technologies to support humankind. This includes exploring ways for technology to improve the futures of variously vulnerable populations, including those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged across the world. And in our paper, we turn to these lives and the intersection of HCI and global development, or HCI4D. We focus on individuals' use of technology to engage with their futures in such contexts of vulnerability and how they achieve goals, targets, outcomes. We draw attention in particular to the aspirations of such individuals or mechanisms they might employ to engage with potential futures. There are perspectives and aspirations in the context of technology and/or development that we drew inspiration from for this paper. First, Arjun Appadurai's essay on the capacity to aspire, where he drew a connection between the capacity to engage with aspirations and the development discourse. The poorer a person is, he says, the more limited is one's universe of aspirations. For development, Appadurai argues that the poor must expand their navigational map and their capacity to aspire, which could then lead to improved livelihoods. And here, as Kentaro said, he draws directly from Amartya Sen's capability approach, which claims that individual capability is foundational to socioeconomic development. And then Kentaro extends this line of thought by emphasizing the need for development-focused research to examine aspirations, as he has already presented. He defines an aspiration as a desire that is persistent and aiming for something higher than one's current situation. He asserts that the field of ICTD must shift focus from addressing needs to operationalizing aspirations, again, as he mentioned, and recommends that an aspiration focus would tilt development efforts towards programs that will that help build people's own ability to achieve their aspirations. Other prior work that we draw on deeply is my own research on the adoption and use of Facebook by predominantly male youth in urban India. This was part of my dissertation work a few years ago. In this study, I observed research participants mobilizing various available resources or avenues to fulfill their emergent aspirations, leading to further and greater aspirations. So, in summary, we build on Kentaro's recommendations to explore how aspirations may be operationalized in designing for development. We draw on findings from fieldwork that was conducted at an after-school center for girls in rural West Bengal. This region is notorious for its problems of trafficking and child marriage, and the chief goal of the center that we studied was to protect its students from both. Our research focuses on the aspirations of and for the girls at the center and examines how technology design might contribute to generating, fulfilling, sustaining, and raising their aspirations. So for goals, we use our analysis to first extend and complicate the lens of aspirations that Kentaro engages with, and look at how research in HCI in general, and HCI4D in particular, might adopt and benefit from moving towards aspirations-based design. But this is not to say that HCI research is not future-oriented at its very core. That's a double negative. In its focus on technological development, outlining implications and recommendations for design, and exploring affordances of emerging technologies, it is constantly looking to pave the way for and generate collective new futures. Individual futures also make an appearance in literature targeting behavior change, for example, on how technology design might assist in improving individual lives based on personal goals. More fundamentally, the field of HCI has long placed paramount importance on the user and on user-centered design, but just centering of the interests of the user doesn't ensure allegiance to explicitly recognizing, raising, or otherwise engaging the user's aspirations. An explicit focus on aspirations can help in articulating, drawing attention to, and expanding users' current and potential imaginations and desires, again, in agreement with Kentaro. With this focus, a lens of aspirations has been proposed across disciplines in the context of global development, education, economics, others. And our research aimed to make a contribution to HCI4D and the larger HCI community by further developing this lens for informing technology design. We also extend work on gender within HCI4D by focusing not so much on the challenge-ridden presence of the young women that we study, but the positive futures that they are driven to create, exploring ways in which technology can contribute there through aspirations-based design. So as I mentioned, our study took place in Baruipur, approximately 25 kilometers from Kolkata. And the after-school center that we studied was run by the local non-profit, which we will call Pragati. And this was established over 40 years ago with a mission of providing education and training for uplifting and empowering female youth in this region and protecting them from the issue of sex trafficking, which results in child marriage. And so over 1.5 years, what we did was we visited Pragati a total of 4 times, separated by 6 months. And in these visits, we conducted 35 hours of total participant observation at the center and nearby villages. Our participants included various stakeholders in the Pragati ecosystem. So that included 26 participants, teachers, 3 teachers, staff members. There were mothers, no fathers were available for interviews, so we tried, and 10, 12th grade students, and then we did group interviews with 40 other students. And the goal of all this data collection was to gain a deeper insight into the day-to-day activities and challenges that these female students engaged with and aspired to overcome. Once the theme of aspirations began to emerge, we went back and forth with the related work on aspirations that I already mentioned, using codes such as short-term aspirations, long-term aspirations, social avenues, technological avenues, among others, and analyze our data in connection with the framework that was in my paper from 5 years ago, and looking at aspirations, avenues, and agency, the cycle. So how recognizing the role that aspirations, agency, and a supporting socio-technical infrastructure can play towards development-oriented goals. There were also limitations in terms of the participants we were able to talk to and the perspectives that we gained access to. We were unable to interview fathers as they were not available to be interviewed and were generally less involved in the activities at the center. And they might have had different perspectives on their aspirations than we got from the daughters, from the mothers. Also, we conducted interviews with some students in groups, which could have affected how they presented their aspirations before other peers and students. And we didn't always encounter the same participants in every visit, but there was substantial overlap. So I'll summarize our findings in the order of the ecologies of aspirations of the girls and of the after school and the parents for the girls, the avenues, both social and technological, that are available or not for the girls to fulfill their aspirations, and the individual and collective agencies that allow these girls to progress towards further aspirations, as well as the factors that challenge these agencies. So with regards to ecologies of aspirations, a student mentioned, if we don't work and don't earn money, they, that is our parents, will get us married, as we cannot contribute to the household income. Also, if we do not study, our parents will think we cannot have a future of financial independence. They will marry us off. We will do both. Another said, no, we do not want to get married. First, we should study and be educated, understand what the world is about, stand on our own feet, start earning money so that we do not have to depend on anyone in future. Then, at the right age, if I want to, I will marry. Yet another said, I see the problems my mother faces for not being educated. She is dependent on my father for everything. She could have been a better parent if she was educated, taken better decisions about raising me. And another said, for looking at the bus number and knowing if it goes in the right direction, or going to the doctor and getting the right medicines as per prescription from the pharmacy, taking medicines at the right dosage, or having knowledge about hygiene, these are the basic things which we need education for. And so we see that the aspirations are not just individual, but they're obviously embedded in these ecologies where they're responding, seeing and responding how their families or how their surroundings are kind of shaping their futures. And through these findings, we complicate Kentaro's differentiation between needs and aspirations to argue that it's not only important where they want to go, but also where they're coming from. Aspirations can be rooted in negative realities, even when they target positive change. And aspirations, while they are certainly intrinsically motivated, they're also extrinsically imposed. And while some aspirations may be more persistent, others may be more fleeting and change over time. One of the mothers said, I have supported my child to become educated, and now she is studying in a college to become a nurse. I hope she will take care of me in old age. So there's certainly social support that is important so that these girls are able to pursue the opportunities they desire to. The center worked hard to ensure that the girls were confident in pursuing career opportunities, that the parents were on board, etc. This was not so visible in the case of the male youth in my prior work, as I mentioned, because this was support that was there, and therefore these challenges were invisible. However, there are also limitations which we saw. So for instance, one student said, I go to study tuition after school in the evening, and sometimes I am late by a few minutes while returning. If I had the mobile, I could have let them know. Also, the family then asks why we are late, but the boys are not asked reasons. But the center and the parents are not keen to allow the girls to carry mobile phones because they are concerned that this might jeopardize their safety. As one of the staff said, you get some missed call from an unknown person, then you ring back and you talk, develop a relationship with that boy, then that person calls you somewhere and you go there and fall in trouble, alluding to sexual assault. Moreover, we have got so many girls who have got trafficked due to mobiles. In sum, fulfillment of aspirations is shaped by the nature of these avenues, and the social and the technological avenues need to align for desired change to take place. Coming to individual and collective agencies, in articulating their aspirations, the girls face different choices, and it is in these choices they make that the fate of their aspirations is determined. As we separated our visits by a gap of 6 months, we were able to see the recalibration that took place among the girls as well as the center staff. Despite the agency of these girls that is evident in their confidence and their aspirational pursuit of career opportunities, there was a mismatch between these aspirations that they had cultivated with the support of Pragati and the parents and what the environment can offer. So these are among the conflicting agencies that we noticed, and I need to go quicker. So as I mentioned, Kentaro defines an aspiration as a desire that is persistent and aiming for something higher than one's current situation. In suggesting that aspirations are a superior frame for conducting and analyzing efforts in technology for international development, he presents 3 conjectures, and he's already gone over those. We kind of focus on the conjecture of operationalizing aspirations, because as we argue in the paper, and maybe it's better to kind of suggest that you read it, the difference between needs and aspirations is kind of fuzzy. Takeaways towards aspirations-based design. Aspirations are embedded in larger socio-technical assemblages that are not entirely intrinsic to the individual in question. We found that the girls' aspirations were embedded in an interwoven web of pre-existing power structures, not easily disentangled. So when the mother believed her daughter's education to be tied to her own well-being later on in life, and the daughter too was keen to be educated, then aspirations were aligned towards this education. When a girl was keen to access the internet using her smartphone, but her parents were unable to afford this, or the Pragati teachers believed that it wouldn't be safe to do so, then aspirations were not aligned towards technology access. So cultural values, gender beliefs and norms, notions around safety, internet access, they all played a role in the fulfillment of aspirations there. So considering how the forces that bring these aspirations to be embedded are individually acting on them and magnifying or diminishing them is critical to engaging in aspirations-based design. I want to say here that the role of the researcher is also important in this assemblage. They influence, to variable degree, the aspirations that might be considered worthy of pursuit or not, and also understanding whose aspirations the researcher is biased towards within the assemblage is critical for framing design objectives. Finally, aspirations are also embedded in a web of aspirations, so there can be aspirations that are a means to an end of aspirations, and they're constantly shaping old and new aspirations, right? So aspirations also have temporal boundaries, we found. So one could have the aspiration of being financially independent, or to be taken care of in old age, but then there are aspirations around the short term, such as what courses one might take next year to achieve those aspirations. So these have different time frames. Finally, aspirations are mutable. They are not set in stone. And so we would argue that they are not persistent. We saw this in the recalibration of the girls' desire to take computer training when they realized that this wasn't getting them the jobs that they wanted. This is understandable, however, in light of the fact that the girls had not used computers before. They did not know how their lives would be different once they had. And this means we need to also think about targeting shifting aspirations. Yes, running out of time. This can also work in reverse. That is, we might engage in technology design that aims to shift, that is, raise or redirect existing aspirations. So in sum, we outline 3 dimensions of aspirations, which are here on the slide. I will jump ahead. So what does it mean then to engage in aspirations-based design? Well, to operationalize aspirations and take an aspirations-based design approach, we suggest it is critical to factor the above 3 dimensions of aspirations into the design process. The paper goes into a lot more depth. I don't really have time to go into that, but I want to say that it means to acknowledge that aspirations are not individualized but embedded, not applicable to a fixed amount of time, nor set in stone. Each of these qualities can guide us towards more and more concrete design choices as we realize the different ways in which they might be shaped. Influencing parents in order to influence girls' aspirations involves leveraging the embeddedness of aspirations. Recognizing that aspirations apply to variable lengths of time can guide us towards more concrete steps instead of unclear, unknown directions, such as breaking down financial stability into digestible goals. Realizing that aspirations are mutable and can shift course might push us towards more resilient designs if we stop expecting that girls, for example, will always wish to learn computer training. We discuss these further in depth, so you can take a look at the paper. These were our contributions, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Neha and Kentaro. So, Kentaro, you can come up. So we have time for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Thank you. So thank you for those two presentations, and also for, in a sense, shining a spotlight on the concept of aspiration in this context. Coming from the context of the capabilities approach and capabilities literature, I was wondering how far you were able to kind of engage with the theorization that had taken place in that literature around adaptive capacities that would kind of fit to some of the things that Kentaro drew attention to, but then also the question of individual and collective capabilities, which would fit to the idea of the kind of embedded aspirations, I think. So my question is, to some degree, how much can we draw on existing theorization that has already taken place? And how far can we kind of draw on this rather than, in a sense, repeat that kind of theorization in our own domain?
I mean, I would say, I don't think that, I mean, I think they're definitely related concepts. I didn't get, go to them in depth. There's more in the paper. To answer your question of how this is connected to, let's say, a more Senian, capability approach, I would say that, Sen doesn't actually specify an order in which capacities are acquired, right? Or you might want to approach them. They're all equally important. Whereas what I'm suggesting is that, if you have lots of things you have to accomplish, there's a question as to what you should do first. And I think that's always true in development. Like, should you provide food versus education, healthcare versus clean, clean water, whatever it is. And one thing that aspirations allow you to do is to actually focus on what the people you're trying to support themselves express as their first major large-scale need, and then to use that as the basis. I agree with Sen in that, yeah, developing people's capacities and developing society's capacities to support people's desires is desirable as an end goal. So then the next question is, what's the order to do those things?
So I'm holding the microphone, but I've been asked to ask you not to answer my question, but instead to gather questions. I don't know why, but let's try it. So I'm curious about the word asset as an alternative to, or a contrast to need, rather than aspiration. And there's a rich history and literature of asset-based community development, for example, and I'm wondering how you might think about how you think assets fits with the landscape of needs and aspirations that you've scoped.
Thank you.
Oh, I already asked. Okay, brilliant. So the other thing I wanted to know was, when we talk about needs, we often talk about expressed needs and latent needs, and one of the things that designers need to do is learn to unearth the latent needs. Is there something called latent aspirations or equivalent to that, things that are not obvious and hidden?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and actually gets at something that I want to say in response to Neha's presentation, which is, I'm trying to intentionally define a particular class of desires to be called aspirations, as much as I'm trying to use the word that most of us have some understanding of. I would say, to the extent that a desire is relatively quickly mutable, I would say by definition that's not an aspiration, right? Whereas what you're calling latent needs, I think, are in some sense often will be longer term, and they might be closer to aspiration. So Rajesh has asked me this question about, is the desire to drink clean water a need or an aspiration? I would say any one given instance of thirst is a need, but the desire to always have access to clean water for your family is an aspiration, right? And those two things are different, and they actually elicit a different response. Because one, you give the cup of water and you're done, right? The other requires you to think about what are the larger capacities, again, that you need to work on, including the personal ones as well as the structural ones, that would allow that larger aspiration to be achieved.
Answer Ellen's question now. You're not following me, yeah? Answer Ellen.
Well, but I want to respond to something that was said. So with regards to needs and aspirations, I think I want to say that it's also a question of who's defining them. And when we talk about needs being extrinsically imposed, then there's the sense that it's being defined by other people, and that other people are deciding that these are your needs, as opposed to aspirations, which are somehow coming from their own innate selves. And I don't think that that's entirely true, because they are being conditioned constantly. And what you said about latent aspirations, I think, speaks to that as well. Like, if aspirations can be shaped, and if they can be raised or they can be sustained, then yes, they could be latent. Yeah, and then speaking to Ellen's questions around assets, I would see aspirations as possibly one form of assets that could be looked at in terms of thinking about design. But certainly there are other assets, and yes, there is a very rich body of literature that looks at kind of assets-based design. That's also a further developing area within HCI, like looking at assets and not deficits, and not just what's missing, but also what communities have that can be capitalized on, and aspirations could be one of those.
All right, last question.
Yeah. So, Neha, you alluded to this, that aspirations can also be shaped. And in fact, lots of people shape aspirations, all the way from leaders to ad makers. And designers have a key role in shaping aspirations as well. And so as creators of solutions, how should we go about thinking of how we shape aspirations of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what we were also, like I mentioned, that as a researcher, you're also, in fact, you are there trying to shape aspirations if you are an action researcher. And so that's something that we need to be conscientious about. Like, how are we trying to shape or change other people's lives in ways that we might be defining them. So this comes to something, again, in the paper, we talk about how, like, when you're working with women in certain cultures, you may think that they need to have all of these rights, and you may come from a Western liberal perspective, but they may not share those values. They may not want those same aspirations. And so that's something that, as researchers and designers, we need to be conscious of.
All right, thank you. I know there's a lot of aspirations for a lot of questions, but we should hold it. Thanks, Neha and Kentaro. So the next paper by Matthew Ziegler, Fresh Insights, User Research Towards Market Information Service for Bihari Vegetable Farmers.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello, sound good? Here we are. Okay, hi. My name is Matt. I am a brand new PhD student at University of Washington under Richard Anderson and Curtis Heimerl. Before starting grad school this past year, I interned at Digital Green, working on some design stuff for a market information service. And some of what we learned from this has implications for the broader discussion about market information services and their effectiveness. So today, I'm first going to talk a little bit about market information services. What are they? Why are they controversial? For context, I'll talk a little bit about Loop, which is a shared transport to market service for vegetable farmers. And the bulk of my presentation is going to be a case study on a region of Bihar, asking what is the role of price information in vegetable markets here, and what can this area tell us more broadly about market information services and their design and usefulness. So, market information services. The idea is, if you're a farmer, you dial a number, tell us what vegetables you have today, and we tell you what are the prices at different nearby markets. And these services can hopefully lead to improvements in smallholder farmers' incomes by giving them better negotiating power against traders and leading to a more efficient distribution of goods across markets. There's been a lot of hype and excitement about market information services in popular media and in global development circles. So there's two main prevailing economic theories of how market information services can hopefully help to improve smallholder farmers' incomes. So the first is this idea of information asymmetry, being that traders have better knowledge of market conditions than farmers, And this gives them a negotiating power against the farmers. And by trying to provide farmers with the same information, we can hopefully help to level the playing field and help farmers recapture some of that lost from the traders. So the second main theory is information scarcity. Now this is one of the coolest graphs that I've ever seen. It was published by Robert Jensen's team in 2007, and they measured a pretty dramatic leveling off of fish prices in different Kerala fish markets as mobile phones were introduced to each region. You can see after the black line in each of those charts this big stabilization in prices. And they explained that fishers were calling different markets before deciding where to land based on the price. And this led to a reduction in wastage at the fish markets, bringing bigger incomes for the fishers. But in the past 5-10 years, there's been a series of mixed and negative evaluations of market information services. A lot of really large-scale, big evaluations haven't been able to observe any changes in prices that farmers were getting or farmers' incomes. And a lot haven't been able to even change or observe any changes in how farmers are selling their vegetables, having this additional market information. So trying to explain these really negative and mixed results, one landmark study that had interviewed farmers and fishers at different sites reported that our informants consistently disclaimed any practice of acquiring market price information for the purpose of comparison between markets by phone or by other means. They found that farmers just didn't find it useful to have the price information for reasons like they didn't have alternative markets to sell in, they didn't want to disrupt their relationships with different people in the markets, or they were hesitant to take the risk of trying to sell somewhere new and unfamiliar. So this study and other studies show us that the usefulness of market information is highly situational. The workings of these vegetable markets and the usefulness of price information depends on a lot of different factors particular to each place. So keeping in mind these mixed findings and lukewarm results of market information services, as we're trying to design a better market information service as a part of Loop, we ask, what is the role of market information in this region of Bihar, Buxar district? So to do this, I'm going to tell you about, first, just some things we know, field observations from Loop's long-term field engagement in this place, and we also interviewed some farmers and built some prototypes of a market information service. So brief diversion now. I am going to tell you a bit about Loop, which is the context through which we're asking about market information services. Loop is a shared transport to market service for farmers. So when a farmer has some vegetables they want to sell, they will dial a number or use a mobile app to schedule a pickup. The next morning, transportation will be arranged. The vegetables will be picked up straight from the farmer's farm and taken directly to the market where they're sold, and then the farmer receives payment on the same day. So the benefits for a farmer are time savings. They don't have to go to the market themselves, pooling of transportation costs, and being able to access new markets that previously weren't practical for them because of the time savings and reduction in transportation costs. So Loop already has a technology stack in place that gives reliable and accurate price data. So in this way, we're already partway to having a market information service. So I'm going to turn now to Buxar district of Bihar, one of the regions where Loop is operating, and tell you, so what are some characteristics we know about this place that we think will affect how farmers are making use of price information here? So Bihar abolished its APMC law in 2006. This was a law requiring that many different crops have to be sold in state markets before they reach consumers. So this led to a proliferation of a lot of differently sized markets of different sizes and structures. And farmers in this area sell in many different markets commonly. There's no one single large market that dominates the whole area. Nowhere at any of the farms or markets we visited in Buxar did we see any refrigeration. So this means that farmers have a short window of just a few days when they must harvest each crop, and it needs to be sold immediately to prevent spoilage. And this leaves farmers really vulnerable to short-term price shocks and leads to really vulnerable prices for a lot of vegetables in these markets. So in markets in Buxar district, you'll find a bunch of different actors. The markets all have different structures and compositions, so depending on the market, you'll find some of these people, but not all of them. In some markets, farmers will sell directly to consumers, so this is less common. Most markets will have local traders who buy in big quantities early in the morning and then sell to consumers at different places throughout the day. Some markets will have long-distance traders who drive big trucks from city to city and stop at many small market towns along the way, buying or selling based on price. Some areas have farm gate traders that skip the markets altogether to avoid paying the different commissions and fees, and then they approach farmers directly on their farms to buy vegetables. And some markets are dominated by commission agents. They're known locally as gadidars. And these agents don't technically buy produce from farmers, but instead they sell to traders on the farmer's behalf, leveraging their business networks and charging a fixed rate commission from the farmers, typically 3 to 5% of the price. So we wanted to better understand how farmers were making decisions about how they sell their vegetables each day and how they're using or not using price information. So we did semi-structured interviews. We talked to 17 loop farmers across 6 villages and 3 market commission agents. We sampled from a bunch of different villages because we were trying to capture some of the diversity we could find in vegetable selling behaviors. So one of the things we found is that farmers had told us that mobile phones became widespread in this area around 2015. A lot of farmers started getting phones 3-4 years ago. And there was already this really common, really ubiquitous behavior of farmers calling in different markets to check prices. For example, we talked to one guy who told us that he called markets almost every day when he had vegetables to check prices, but he only ever sold through one commission agent. So we asked him, if you only ever sell to one commission agent and you never change your mind based on the price, then why do you bother calling to check the prices? And he told us, well, when the prices are good, then I'm happy, and when the prices are bad, then I'm sad. It's just having this information just told him a little bit about his life. It's, will I have some extra money next week, or will I need to tighten my belt? But we did hear a lot of farmers told us that they use price information in vegetable marketing in different ways. For example, we did hear a lot of farmers tell us that they did use the price information to decide which markets to go to. Most commonly, when it was worth it to spend the extra money to go to a more distant market versus when to sell locally. We heard reports of arbitrage, so traders were using mobile phones to get prices at different markets and then going and buying where prices were low and selling where prices were high. Some farmers told us that they did use the price information to negotiate with traders. For example, this guy told us, we negotiate with farm gate traders based on the previous day's market rates. We offer them 2 rupees above yesterday's rate, and then the traders negotiate it down to 1 rupee above yesterday's rate. So in the paper, we go into a lot more depth on how these mechanisms work and some of the variation and exceptions we saw. But another thing that we heard from these farmers was that there had been some big changes in the ways these markets worked since the arrival of mobile phones. So we heard from a bunch of farmers that there had been a substantial uptick in the number of traders, both at markets and at farm gates. So it was both that more local people were getting into the business of vegetable trading and more traders were coming from distant places. Because of this uptick in traders, there were shifts in the activity levels of different markets. Notably, a lot of farmers that previously had to travel to distant markets to sell vegetables could now sell locally because there was more activity there. This guy told us, the traders from far off our market are coming here now, so there's no point in going to our market anymore. Some farmers told us that there had been fewer price crashes, so stabilization of prices. And obviously we can't directly attribute, we don't know for sure that all of these changes were because of the arrival of mobile phones, but some of our interview subjects directly attributed mobile phones to these changes, like the example of farm gate traders. Now it was common for these farm gate traders to call farmers on their phones and make deals with them before coming to pick up vegetables on their farm, and that wasn't possible before the arrival of mobile phones. But we also heard a lot of reports of major improvements of road connectivity around the same time, and that also probably played an important role in most of these changes. So the usefulness of price information is highly situational, even among the farmers that we interviewed. There are a lot of different factors that go into how farmers sell vegetables other than just prices. So this guy, for example, told us, I never take any decision on prices. When my volume is low, I go to Dumri market. When it's high, I go to Naya Bhojpur market. And then we go into a lot more depth on these factors in the paper. It's practically half the paper, but I'm going to quickly list off some of them for you right now. So one of the most common overriding concerns we heard was supply gluts. So say if I'm trying to sell tomatoes, especially in a small market, and then somebody else shows up with a whole truckload of tomatoes, the price for tomatoes might crash, and I might not be able to sell my tomatoes at all. So farmers told us over and over again that they were just more worried about being able to sell their whole quantity than getting like a slightly better price, like 1-2 rupees extra per kg. So they were always playing this game of trying to judge the capacity of each market on each day. All goes wrong if you keep switching agents. Farmers commonly form relationships with different commission agents, and the agents expect loyalty from the farmers, and a farmer can get a bad reputation in a market from switching agents often. Farmers often had credit relationships where in exchange for getting loans from the agents, they were obligated to sell only through that agent. We saw a big disparity in marketing skills. We talked to some farmers who were really savvy in selling vegetables in dozens of different markets and knew how to work the system really well and were giving us all kinds of tips and tricks. We also talked to farmers who had been bound to selling to only one agent in one market, and he was really hesitant to try somewhere new. It's a daunting task to try selling where you don't know the mechanisms of this market. They all have different workings. Physical danger. To sell in a distant market, you have to travel overnight to get there in time for the early rush. Participants were afraid of being robbed or having to pay bribes. And one of the simplest but most important reasons was just convenience. Like this guy said, I couldn't manage with everything, I'm growing old. Selling vegetables is hugely time-consuming for farmers. And since agriculture is already so time intensive, farmers would often just opt for the easiest, simplest route of selling in a local market to a local trader. This was also, convenience was one of the main reasons why farmers started using the loop service. So now, some of our ongoing work is we're looking at these factors through the lens of a designer trying to think, some of these factors present barriers to farmers accessing better prices at different markets. Can we design interventions that help them overcome these barriers? So some of these are addressable via extensions to a market information service, and then some of them are better addressable by other media. So we built a prototype market information service. Here are some example screens from it, asking questions like, can we address the unfamiliarity barrier by giving you some more information about each market, like how far away is it, how much does it cost to get there? Can we help farmers gauge price volatility by showing you a few days of past prices? Can we help farmers make connections in new markets by giving you a screen with contacts of traders? And we have an early stage deployment, but we need more work to really understand how these things would or would not be affecting the ways farmers sell vegetables, or for example, what kinds of relationships they might form using these contacts. But some of these problems are obviously not addressable by a market information service, just like the problem of the market is too far away, it takes too long to get there. Market information service can't do anything about that. But other aspects of the loop system, like just having the loop aggregation, if the farmers don't have to go to the markets themselves, that can really help to address the problem of time and distance. For the credit relationships with traders, as we're trying to help farmers start accepting digital payments, that can help them build up a formal financial history and hopefully help them access alternative sources of credit. For the problems of needing to form relationships and having unfamiliarity with new markets, a lot of our interview subjects suggested that they wanted more opportunities to network with farmers that sold in different markets, to learn from them how to utilize those markets. People suggested market field trips, of just going to the market without the pressure of having to sell vegetables on that day, to learn how that market worked, who are the big traders there. And for the disparity in marketing skills, there are different organizations doing training courses. Loop is experimenting with training videos. For example, this picture is showing a bunch of Loop farmers watching a video about the best way to cut cauliflower to send to different types of markets. So my takeaways are, first, that in this area we saw really heavy usage of mobile phones in vegetable marketing for all kinds of reasons like price checking, negotiation, choosing markets. Listening, thanks everybody Digital Green and Loop for working on this. I'm done, that's my talk.
Perfect timing, perfect timing. Any questions?
Thanks. Hopefully a quick question. What proportion of farmers would you say right now either have access to or I guess in particular use some sort of market information service, just to get a sense of the ecosystem and how close or far you are from reaching like general equilibrium type effects?
So in Bihar, a lot of places have a government-run market information service. As far as we know, Bihar doesn't have anything like that. So farmers didn't really have any kind of formal market information service. We didn't see anything like that. But there was this really kind of common system of calling around, just this informal system of using mobile phones to call people and get prices, or just asking from other farmers. They had different ways of getting it.
Okay. Hi. Great talk. Really, really interesting. I was interested in that comment at the end from sort of previous anecdotal studies. An example where you get this connection between the farmer and the market in terms of value added, because actually if you can add value to your product, then you're capturing more of the value chain, because actually, you know, being the producer, just the raw material producer, is actually the weakest point in the value chain. And actually, those questions of how you might get information from the customer back to the farmer in terms of how they can add value, that seems to be
potentially more beneficial than market information. You know, you get more and more market information, so that takes away some inefficiencies in the market. But if you're a very weak player in the market anyway, all that means is your price goes down.
Wait, sorry, I couldn't hear you very well. The question is...
Well, I guess the question is, are you following up on those questions about adding value to the product? So when you were talking about how you chop your cauliflower, that's value added. And I'm just wondering, you know, whether actually there might be more advance for a lot of these farmers through learning to add value to their product than being able to negotiate a slightly better price on the day.
Okay. I can tell you there is work on integrating kind of Digital Green's more established video education service with the Loop service. And there's work on kind of trying to get farmers directly in touch with big buyers. So is that kind of what you're asking? Like,
all right, thank you. We have to take this offline. Thanks again for your presentation. We have Lingxi Hong talking about characterization of internal migrant behavior in the immediate post-migration period using cell phone traces.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lingxi Hong from University of Maryland. So before my presentation, I'll say 2 points. First, my study is most like data-driven approach, so it's like a little bit different flavor from all the other presentations. And then the mobility here is most physical conception about mobility, not like social mobility. So I'll introduce our work about using cell phone data to learn the migrant behaviors. This study is collaborated with researchers from iSchool in University of Maryland and also researchers from Telefonica Research. They mostly provide the cell phone data for us, and then the professor from sociology in University of Maryland. There are two different types of studies on internal migrants. One is the macro level study, and then the micro level studies. For macro level studies, researchers usually use surveys and census data to learn the micro perspective. For example, the demographic of the migration flows. But for this kind of study, they usually fail to specify the details of the individual behaviors. And for the micro level studies, researchers usually use interviews and diaries to get the specific details of individuals. But for this kind of study, it really takes a lot of human efforts, and it's not very easy to scale. So for cell phone data is widely used in developing countries and developed countries, and it's also prevailing in different groups of people. So with cell phone data, we can achieve both the macro level perspectives and also the micro level perspectives. The macro level means we have large geographic scales. The micro level means we can learn the individual behaviors, the specific individual behaviors. And so the two figures here show what kind of information we can extract from cell phone behaviors. One is the spatial dynamics behavior. So the circle here means the cellular towers, and the polygon area are the areas where the cellular towers are in charge. So when you are close to a cellular tower and have a connection with it, the tower will generate one record. So with this kind of time series records, we can generate the mobility trajectory of each person. For the social types, we assume that the cell phone usage social network can represent one's cell phone network, can represent one's real network. And in this study, we used the 8 months of call and message data, and it covers the whole country of Mexico. With this data, we can examine the individual behaviors at a very large scale that cannot be achieved by the qualitative studies. So the contribution of data-driven method is like there are two sides. One is with the data-driven insights, we can better support the decision-making process. And then because the scale of this kind of study, we can discover unsolved problems or understudied problems that haven't been examined, and this will help the researchers for further qualitative research. This is our proposed framework. It has 3 main components. One is the identification of migrants out of the cell phone traces. And then the migrants are defined as people who have the change of residence. And the residence means they have the same location for 3 consecutive months. And we also find there are a lot of like people who have short-term change of residency, like the 4th and 5th example. For these people, we are not sure whether they are migrants or not, so they are not studied in our project. So we focus on the migrants and the locals. Locals are people who stay in one place all the time. And we focus on 2 research questions. One is the characterization of the post-migration behaviors. One is the role of the pre-migration behaviors on the post-migration activities. So this is the migrant identification framework, but it's a little bit complicated. I'll jump it. And if you are interested in the details, you can refer to our paper. And after the application of the migrant detection algorithm, we will label each user with local or unknown or migrants. But it's not very easy for us to validate for each cell phone user whether they are migrants or not. If we like make calls to these people, this is like survey methods. So we validate these detecting migrants based on the macro perspective validation. So we can compute the based on the detecting migrants, we can compute the migration flow between municipalities and then compare this kind of migration matrix with the census migration matrix. And we compute the correlation. They are high, and we also use the gravity models to compare the migration flow, the census migration flow and the detecting migration flow, and the results are also very good in terms of different kind of gravity models and in terms of different constraints. With the detecting migrants, we can continue answering the 2 questions. One is the characterization of the post-migration behaviors. We examined the features from 2 perspectives, spatial dynamics and social ties. For spatial dynamics, we have these features like number of municipalities visited, daily mobility, radius of duration. For each feature, it has a specific social construct meaning. For example, daily mobility is the mainly shows the short trip behaviors. The radius of duration shows the job dispersion. And from the analysis, we have several findings. The main finding is migrants, they usually have more irregular mobility behaviors, and their mobility distance are usually much longer than local communities. Another part is the social ties. So we have features like number of contacts, number of calls, entropy of contacts, and ratio, number and ratio of new contacts and calls. So for the new contacts or calls, we first build the social network for each person and then comparing the contacts with the existing stable social network. And so this feature shows the adaptation of the user to adaptation of the people to the new settings. It's the expansion, the temporal expansion of their social network. And we also examine the local costs and the ratio of local costs to see if there if there is the role to offset the role places play in the social network. So our finding is that migrants, they usually have similar number of calls with local people, but their contacts are much fewer. So which means they have very limited social resources, and migrants, they usually have lower entropy. Also, migrants add fewer new contacts to their social network after migration, which means they have difficulties in adapting to the new environment, and they have fewer local calls. And another question we want to answer is how their pre-migration behaviors will affect their post-migration activities. For each of the post-migration features, we run regression analysis with all the pre-migration features. And this table shows the regression coefficients and significance. So we can see the pattern here. The post-migration behaviors are very consistent with the pre-migration behaviors, which means their behavior pattern doesn't change as much. But for persons who have better adaptability to the new environment, in the pre-migration period, they usually have a lot of calls to the post-migration home. And also, we find if their number of contacts is large, so the number of new contacts is positively related to the number of contacts, which means if one has already established a very large social network, they tend to be more easy to add more new contacts to their network. So these are the findings. So the findings mostly are people who communicate more. People who communicate more generally are better rerouting in their new society, and if they have more connection with people from the whole society, they also tend to show better adaptability. And post-migration activities are predictable with the pre-migration behaviors. Thanks. Any questions?
That was good.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for presenting this interesting work. I have two questions. One, I was wondering if you could tell us more about how you had access to this data and things related to consent and all that. And second, given the rise of the anti-migration sentiment that we're seeing in places like Europe and the US, predicting and analyzing behavior that can actually put these populations in more vulnerability, how do you see like a study like this playing out in such a complicated times that we're living, given the anti-migration sentiment?
Okay, so the first question about how we get the data. So we get the data from Telefonica Research. We have a long-term collaboration with them. Also, my advisor, she's also a previous Telefonica researcher, and they apply fundings from World Bank and the United Nations. And World Bank and United Nations, they have this kind of protocol with the telecommunication companies, and then they give us the data. And the data is encrypted and a little bit old, so there's not much privacy issues involved. And for the second question, I think so they have certain limitations about what kind of questions we can look into. So that's the only limitations. Okay. And so for the second question, I think our study is mostly like, it's like to try to find the understudied phenomena, to try to find the issues that qualitative researchers, they can look into. Because our study is scaled to a very large geospatial scale, so there are different contexts. For example, for migrants migrate from urban places to rural places, there will be different in their behaviors, and qualitative researchers will look into why these kind of issues raises. And we can also look into like migrants between different municipalities, and to examine the socioeconomic context of these municipalities and why this behavior is like that. So it's mostly like some research that will induce more research questions for qualitative research, a qualitative study.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to the next presentation. So Mayank Singh and Arshdeep Singh are going to be talking about embedded neural nets in traffic.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mayank with my partner Arshdeep, and we'll be presenting our paper, Embedded CNN-based Vehicle Classification and Counting in Non-Lane Road Traffic. Well, the title can be a bit intimidating at first, so we'll break it into individual words and see what they mean. Classification and counting of vehicles on the road. Let's say the government is planning to build a flyover, and they are worrying where should we build it, or should we build it or not, would it even lessen the traffic? Well, we had such a situation in Bengaluru when they were trying to build the steel bridge. Well, such types of discussions need to be backed up with data of the traffic, and such data could only become if we have such a system of classification and counting. Also, the traffic management could benefit from such fine-grained information of the traffic. This could lead to development of intelligent red lights, and this could, let's say, also help in automatic traffic violation detections. And very similarly, we had this policy, odd even rule in Delhi a few months back, where the cars with odd numbers were allowed to ply on odd dates, and the even license number cars were allowed to run on even dates. We had a lot of discussion and debates whether this policy, which originally had the aim to reduce pollution, was beneficial or not. And again, such types of debates need to be backed up with statistical data, and again, these systems of classification and counting help us there. CNNs. Convolutional neural networks are deep learning models which are used extensively in image classification and detection, medical image analysis, natural language processing, and whatnot. Also, these are the state-of-the-art technology that are being used in self-driving cars. So these form the core machine learning models for our research. Non-lane. See, the traffic in India is a real mess. If you see the traffic in Ahmedabad and compare it to the traffic in cities like Berkeley and Massachusetts, you'll see there's a lot of difference. The lack of lane discipline in our country leads to higher amount of occlusion. Even the vehicle types, if you see on the left-hand side, there are a lot of yellow rickshaws and bicycles and trucks, which are very different as compared to the traffic in developed countries. And the available data sets are usually based on the traffic from countries like Massachusetts and other. Also, the roads in our country are not as rectangular as they should be supposed to be. And another difference between our traffic and the available datasets is that the datasets are usually there for the development and training of self-driving cars. And the view that a driver gets is very different from a view that a camera gets, which is hung on a traffic pole, for example. So if you see, if we train our machine learning models only on the available data sets, that would not really work in our country. So we had to gather our own data set for our research. Embedded. You see, if we follow such a system where the traffic camera is transmitting its feed to the GPU servers across a lot of distance apart, the network cost would be very high. And in countries like India, where the network connectivity issue is a real problem, and it's not also readily available in all the developing cities, so such a system would not be the best thing to do. What we're trying to do is that if we can somehow do in situ processing there itself on the road, and then only if we do the computation there itself and transfer the important classification and count numbers to the, say, the servers, then we would be tremendously reducing the internet usage and thereby reducing the cost. So this is where the embedded devices come in.
Since we already discussed the problem in countries like developing countries like India, like the non-lane traffic, so we, in collaboration with Vihan Technologies, which is a startup which is working on traffic automation, and along with Delhi Integrated Multimodal System Limited, so we collected a data set on our own and we annotated that data set. So these are the video frames from that data set. So this is the front view of the road, and you can observe that the camera is a has a fisheye lens. And next is the back view of the road, and this is also back view of the road, but the difference between the former one is that there are buses that are flying over this route, and this is a side view, as you can see, of a highway. And the difference between the other three is that the level of camera is a lower at the same level of the vehicles, which is not the case with the previous one. So there is quite amount of variations in the data set that we had collected. Yes. So since there hasn't been much work done on the traffic automations in developing countries like India, so there hasn't been any standardization in the camera hardware or the camera positioning. So this leads to a great variation in the video frames that were collected by us. So in total there were 5,562 images that we collected, and we annotated those images, and total number of annotations were 32,088, and with an average of 6 annotations per image, ranging from 2 annotations in the data set, subset of the data which has side view of a highway, and to the 15 in the subset of data which has front view with a fisheye lens. So the size of the data set is comparable to the existing data sets, and this could be a great help to the computer vision community, which can tackle some of the challenges in the developing countries like India. So the data set is available on request. And so for our work we used YOLO convolution neural network architecture. So it has state-of-the-art performance on object detection, and so what it does is it breaks the image into a grid and makes predictions on each of the grid, and so the output is then thresholded by some probability value, and we get the final result in that way. So it is a single pass, and it has low latency. It offers low latency. Yes. So since the data set that we had 7 annotated classes, so we made predictions on these particular classes. So what we had is initially we took a YOLO model which is pre-trained on MS COCO dataset, and we fine-tuned on Pascal VOC and KT dataset. And since our dataset had 4 various subsets of data depending on the camera and their positioning, and so we fine-tuned the YOLO network on each of those these 4 subsets. So we had 4 neural networks which were fine-tuned on these 4 separately, and we took the complete dataset and we fine-tuned a model on the complete dataset. So in total we have 5 different networks with different weights. So before going into the numbers and graphs, I'll just show we can visually see the performance of the neural network on the images in the test set. So here each class is labeled by a different color, and these are the results that we observed. So now we'll go to the MAP. So on y-axis are the MAP scores. So higher the MAP scores are better, and on x-axis are the subset of the data depending on the camera positioning that I had discussed earlier. So in the front view, so here the red one is the model which is trained, fine-tuned on the subset of the data which has front view and it has a fisheye lens, and the light blue one is the model which is trained on the complete dataset. So here we can see that the model which is trained on the complete dataset performs better, but the model which is trained on the subset of the data, even though it has lesser number of images, performs fairly well. And similarly in the back view with the non-bus route. But here we could observe that the subset of the data which has side view of the highway, the model which is fine-tuned, which is here it's shown as the dark blue. So the model which is fine-tuned on that particular subset of the data performs well, but the model which is fine-tuned on the complete dataset, that performs poorly. So this from here we can take the point that even though the model is fine-tuned on the side view of the highway, it cannot be used somewhere where the camera positioning is different from the data which is fine-tuned on. So the standardization of camera positioning is important and hardware is important. So these are the precision values. On y-axis are the precision values. So higher the precision is better, and on x-axis are the 7 classes which the model made predictions on. So the model makes fairly good predictions for classes like cars and buses, but it has a lower precision value for bicycle and trucks. So this is because of the fact that, as you might have observed, there is a huge amount of variations in the auto rickshaws, and in a data set we found that there were several trolleys and various other vehicles which were annotated as trucks. So there was lesser distribution among the various classes, and so we clubbed various classes into one, and so therefore the model didn't get it right. And since the dataset had images from the roads, and so there were lesser number of pedestrians, which accounts for the lower precision value for pedestrian class. So these are the recall values, and on the y-axis are the recall values, and on the x-axis is the y-pixel range. So lower the y-pixel, more is the distance from the camera. So the model makes fairly good predictions on the part of the image which is nearer to the camera. So since we are only concerned with the classification results, and getting a count of the number of vehicles, we can restrict our computation only to the part of the image which is nearer to the camera, and this also reduces the overhead cost in the dataset annotation.
This was all about the object detection model and the data sets. Now we'll see where does the embedded devices come in. Well, before jumping onto that, there is one important concept to be discussed. In a neural network computation, there are two main phases, training and the inference. During the training part, we feed some input to the network does some computation, and we get the output. This is the forward pass. Now we compare this output to the actual ground truth, and based on the loss or the difference or the error, we propagate this loss backwards, and then we update the weights of the network. And this is the backward pass. So, but on the other end, in the inference or the testing part, there is only one forward pass where we input something, the network uses its trained weights, and it generates some output. As we see, the training process is computation intensive, and there's actually no need for the training itself to be done on the embedded devices. The training is usually done on strong computers with a heavy GPU, and the same we did the same thing with our models. We use these embedded devices, the NVIDIA Raspberry Pi and the neural compute stick, but the training done on separate computers. And this Jetson board is a fairly costly device which costs around $1,000, but it has a strong RAM of 8 GB and a heavy GPU. The next up is the Raspberry Pi 3B, which is a fairly cheap device, but it has only 1 GB of RAM and 4 CPU cores. Next is the Intel stick, which was made by Intel. It's known as the neural compute stick. It has a vision processing unit of its own, and it can be plugged into the USB port of a Raspberry Pi device, and it can actually help. This duo is a very powerful combination, as we'll see in the next slide. In this slide, we see the evaluation of our embedded devices, and we compare the current and latency numbers. On the x-axis, we have the hardware and software combinations. The hardware refers to the embedded devices that we discussed. And for the software part, we ran the cafe implementation of MobileNet SSD, which is another popular model just like YOLO, the TensorFlow implementation of MobileNet SSD, and the cafe implementation of YOLO. On the y-axis, on the left-hand side, we see the average current, which is denoted by the red boxes. And on the right-hand side, we see the inference latency in milliseconds, which is denoted by the blue dots, the dotted blue line. If we see the first graph, the Jetson board, which was a costly device with a strong GPU and strong RAM, it does computation with very low latency, but it draws in a large amount of current. The Raspberry Pi device does computation with a lot of latency, a high latency, but it draws in low current. The Raspberry Pi's device, when used with the Mobilities stick, it gets the best of both the worlds. It has latency comparable to the Jetson board, which was the first graph, and it draws in power, which is very similar to the Raspberry Pi device without the Mobilities stick. So this combination can actually lead to can actually be used on the production side. So with this, we'd like to conclude our presentation by saying that the cost synergy, as we discussed the cost synergy and latency trade-offs in this presentation, but the thing to be kept in mind is that whatever we are doing must be in sync with the application for which we are developing the stuff. For example, if we can draw solar energy power from the lamppost, we need not much worry about the energy considerations of our model. But at the same time, if we are installing our device on a car which draws energy from the car's battery, we should worry that our model is energy sensitive. Very similarly, if we are making something which is doing, say, real-time traffic violation detection, we must make sure that our model has very low latency. But if our model is just counting cars for some government policy for which latency is not much required, we can be a bit relaxed there. Another important takeaway is that in situ processing of video frames is actually possible with the duo that we discussed, which was the Raspberry Pi with the Mobilities stick. This, when used in developing countries, can actually reduce the network costs involved and lead to innovations. Also, our anecdotal discussions with the Delhi Traffic Police Commissioner states that they agree that it is just impossible with the growing population for manual monitoring of traffic, and they would really welcome it if technology is able to somehow automate this process for them. Thank you.
Any questions? Great.
Hi. One of the things that I was interested in is necessarily density. So in the model that you have trained, did you take pictures/images from differently dense road structures like rural roads look very different from urban roads, or even semi-urban roads or small lanes and roads look very different from very adjacent large highways, and numbers or like the way traffic flows in these often changes drastically. So I was wondering if that's a consideration that you had and how you thought about that problem.
Well, you were asking about the data set, right? So as we said, the data set that is available with on online sites is very different from the Indian traffic. So Vehant is an startup, a very old startup from IT Delhi, and there's another organization, DIMTS. So with their help, we were able to get hold of 4 camera installations, and these are the 4 types of images that we acquired with them.
The question was really from your data set, were these camera installations really in differently dispersed locations, or were they all clustered in a particular locality/geographic region?
everything was from Delhi itself, but not from the very same sites, from different locations, but everything was in Delhi itself. So we are working on Delhi. We are thinking to expand to Noida, Bengaluru, Noida, and other cities. We'll do that slowly. This was just a research of 2 months, so we didn't really have a lot of time.
All right. Thank you for. So thank you all. So the open session. So the next session is at 4:40. So it's slightly pushed. So get some chai, coffee, and then show up for the open sessions. Thanks.